The hollows of Heroic in the northeastern region of the United States, nestled between sprawling forests and fog-laden hills, lies the small town of Heroic. To an outsider, Heroic would appear quaint and unremarkable, a place untouched by time and the chaos of modern life. But those who dwell within its borders know better, for Heroic harbors secrets darker than the thick woods that surround it. The town was founded in the late 17th century by a band of settlers who, as legend has it, were fleeing more than just religious persecution. They were escaping a sinister past that no one dared speak of. This ominous beginning set the tone for a community that grew inward, suspicious of outsiders and fiercely protective of its mysterious history. Our story begins with Jameson Jamie Clark, a young writer from New York City seeking solitude and inspiration for his next horror novel. Jamie, captivated by the allure of Heroic's enigmatic background, decided to rent an old cottage at the edge of town for the summer. The cottage, an aging structure with creaky floors and an air of neglect, was last occupied by Eleanor Rigby, a reclusive artist who vanished without a trace several years prior. The locals whispered that the woods had claimed her, as they had so many others. As Jamie settled into the cottage, he began to explore Heroic, his presence met with polite nods and wary eyes. He quickly befriended the town librarian, an elderly woman named Agnes who had lived in Heroic all her life. Agnes provided Jamie with a trove of archives and folklore that painted a picture of a town haunted by an ancient curse. According to the records, every 50 years, the town experiences a series of horrifying events that culminate in the disappearance of several townsfolk. The disappearances were always preceded by the sighting of strange, twisted figures in the woods, described in hushed tones as the Hollow Ones. These creatures were said to be the spirits of the original settlers, cursed to wander the forest for their sins. Fascinated and a bit unnerved, Jamie delved deeper, his days consumed by research and his nights by writing. But as he uncovered more about Heroic's past, strange occurrences began to unfold. Objects in his cottage moved inexplicably, and whispers echoed through the hallways at night. Undeterred, Jamie pressed on, his curiosity morphing into obsession. One afternoon, Jamie stumbled upon an old map in the library's archives. The map detailed a forgotten section of the woods, marked with an ominous X. Agnes, upon seeing the map, turned pale and advised Jamie against pursuing it further. But Jamie's determination was unshakable. He needed to see what was hidden there, believing it held the key to understanding the curse. That night, under the cover of darkness, Jamie ventured into the woods, armed with only a flashlight and the old map. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed alive, with shadows shifting and the wind carrying whispers. Hours passed until he came upon a clearing that was not supposed to exist, at the center of which stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its branches twisted into grotesque shapes. As Jamie approached the tree, the air grew thick and cold. The ground around the tree was littered with personal belongings, watches, glasses, even old, faded photographs, as if the tree itself had consumed those who came too close. Mesmerized by the sight, Jamie failed to notice the figures emerging from the trees around him. They were pale, their eyes hollow, their movements jerky and unnatural. Terrified, Jamie tried to run, but the figures were fast, encircling him with inhuman speed. He screamed, but the forest seemed to swallow the sound. Just as the figures reached for him, everything went black. Jamie awoke the next morning in his bed, his clothes muddy and torn, with no memory of how he returned. Shaken, he tried to convince himself it was just a nightmare, but the mud on his boots and the scratches on his arms told a different story. He knew then that he had to leave Heroic, but as he packed his belongings, a chilling thought stopped him. The cycle was about to begin again, and the town needed him to uncover the truth. That day, Jamie went to the library to confront Agnes, but she was nowhere to be found. In her place was a note, written in shaky handwriting, "Stop looking or you'll never leave Heroic." And so, Jamie's resolve was set. He would stay, not just to write his novel, but to save Heroic from its curse, even if it meant facing the Hollow Ones again. Little did he know, the town had other plans, and Jamie was about to discover that some secrets are better left buried. Continuing from where we left off, as dusk fell over Heroic, the once charming town took on a sinister hue, and the weight of unseen eyes seemed to press upon Jamie. His once keen desire to peel back the layers of Heroic's mysteries now tangled with a primal urge to flee, to escape the oppressive, eerie silence that blanketed the town as night approached. Yet, his writer's mind, always chasing the next line, the next twist, clung to the intrigue of Heroic's curse. Despite the warning in Agnes's note, despite the chilling encounter in the woods, Jamie could not leave, not yet. He felt an inexplicable bond to the town, as if the very soil of Heroic entwined with his fate, pulling him deeper into its shadowy embrace. He spent the following days in a frenzied state, visiting the homes of the locals, gathering their stories and tales of the past occurrences linked to the 50-year cycle. Each resident he spoke to told tales steeped in fear and resignation. Their voices were tinged with the same dread, their stories punctuated by moments where they looked over their shoulders, as if expecting to see one of the hollow ones standing in the doorway. Among the tales, one story stood out, recounted by an old man named Walter, who lived on the edge of town near the forest. Walter, a lifelong resident, was a child during the last cycle. He told Jamie of a night when a fog rolled in thicker than any he had seen before or since. That night, his younger sister, Ada, disappeared from their home. Despite a search that lasted weeks, she was never found, and Walter believed that the Hollow Ones took her to the heart of the forest. Walter's story struck a chord in Jamie. The idea of a recurring fog intrigued him, and he pressed Walter for details. Walter described it as a living entity, saying, "The fog ain't just mist, boy. It's the breath of the forest, and it takes what it wants." He warned Jamie that the signs were aligning for another such event, and if Jamie was wise, he would not be in Heroic when it arrived. Fueled by Walter's warnings, Jamie began to see patterns that he hadn't noticed before. The cycles didn't just involve disappearances but were preceded by smaller, more subtle disturbances, pets gone missing, strange marks on trees, and an increase in the sighting of wildlife fleeing the woods. These discoveries compelled Jamie to revisit the forest, to face whatever horrors awaited, but this time with more preparation. He gathered supplies, a camera to document his findings, salt as per an old superstition Walter mentioned could ward off evil spirits, and a sturdy flashlight. As he approached the same clearing, the air turned cold, and a light mist began to form, swirling around his feet. The ancient tree stood as before, stark against the darkening sky. Jamie felt a vibration in the air, a hum of energy that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. He placed his camera on a tripod, pointing it at the tree, and sprinkled a circle of salt around himself, a meager protection, but it gave him a semblance of security. As night deepened, so did the mist. It grew in density, becoming a fog that soon enveloped the entire clearing. Jamie's heart raced as he peered into his camera's viewfinder, watching as shapes began to materialize in the fog. They were human in form but moved with an eerie fluidity, as if they were part of the mist itself. Jamie documented everything, his camera capturing the forms as they drew nearer. The air grew oppressively still, and a deep, resonant voice echoed through the trees, though Jamie could see no source for it. The voice spoke a warning, an ancient phrase repeated thrice, "Leave or be lost." Panic clawed at Jamie's resolve. He stepped back, faltering, his foot crossing the salt line. At that moment, the figures surged forward, their forms becoming more distinct, more terrifying. They were indeed the Hollow Ones, their eyes empty voids of despair, their mouths agape in silent screams. Jamie ran, the fog swirling chaotically, disorienting him as he tried to find his way back to the cottage. Branches clawed at his clothes, tripping him, as if the forest itself was determined to keep him there. He could hear the Hollow Ones behind him, their whispers like leaves rustling violently in a storm. He barely made it back to the cottage, slamming the door shut and collapsing against it, panting and drenched in sweat. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, and through it, Jamie could see the faint outlines of the hollow ones, watching, waiting. The night passed with Jamie trapped inside, the fog enveloping the cottage until dawn when it finally receded back into the woods. Exhausted but alive, Jamie knew he had to make a decision. Despite the terror of the night, his drive to uncover the truth, to understand the nature of the Hollow Ones and Heroic's dark heart, only intensified. He couldn't leave, not when he was so close, not when the cycle was about to climax. He decided he would stay until the end of the summer, until he had answers, or until the town took him too. The next day, under the heavy gaze of an overcast sky, Jamie ventured into town to gather more supplies and research. The townspeople seemed more withdrawn than usual, their eyes darting nervously as they hurried about their business. The local grocery store, usually a hub of chatter, was subdued, the conversations whispered, fleeting. Jamie sensed their fear, a tangible dread that something terrible was imminent. In the afternoon, he returned to the library to find it deserted, save for a note on the door stating it was closed due to an emergency town meeting. Curious and anxious to understand more, Jamie made his way to the town hall, a decrepit building at the center of Heroic, its walls as old as the secrets it housed. Inside, the hall was packed with residents, their faces etched with worry. At the front, the mayor, a stern woman with sharp features, was speaking in hushed tones about the need for preparations and precautions. As Jamie entered, a hush fell over the crowd, their suspicion of the outsider palpable. He found a spot at the back, leaning against a wall, straining to catch the words that fluttered with urgency from the mayor. "We all know why we're here," the mayor was saying. "The signs have been clear this year, clearer than any of us have ever seen. The fog last night was just the beginning. We need to be ready." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd, along with an undercurrent of fear. One by one, people stood to share their encounters with the strange occurrences around town, the disappearance of pets, the strange markings on trees, the sightings of shadowy figures near the woods. With each account, Jamie's notes grew, each story a piece of the puzzle he was desperately trying to solve. After the meeting, Jamie approached the mayor, introducing himself and his purpose in Heroic. The mayor, Mrs. Langley, regarded him with a mixture of skepticism and resignation. "You're playing with fire, Mr. Clark," she warned. "This town isn't just another story for you to exploit. These are real lives, real dangers." Jamie assured her of his respect and intentions, asking for any information that could help him understand. Reluctantly, Mrs. Langley agreed to speak with him privately. They met in her office, where she pulled out an old, dusty book from a locked drawer. It was a journal dating back over a century, containing entries from various mayors of Heroic, each chronicling the events of the cycles. As Jamie flipped through the pages, he found a pattern in the entries. Every 50 years, the events escalated, starting with small disturbances and culminating in a night of horrific events, the Night of the Reckoning, as it was called. This was the night when the barrier between Heroic and the otherworldly forces at its border thinned to a near-transparent veil, allowing the Hollow Ones to claim what they believed was theirs. "This year," Mrs. Langley said, pointing to the calendar, "is the 50th year. And from what we've seen, this reckoning will be like no other. The signs have been too strong, too clear." Armed with this new knowledge, Jamie felt both a sense of dread and a burning need to witness the reckoning, to document it, to perhaps find a way to help the town. He thanked Mrs. Langley, who only shook her head sadly, as if mourning a decision already made, a fate already sealed. That night, as Jamie lay in bed, the wind began to howl outside, a mournful, eerie sound that seemed to whisper secrets in a language just beyond understanding. The air grew chill, and the fog began to roll in again, thicker, more oppressive than before. Jamie knew this was the beginning, the prelude to the reckoning. He set up his equipment, checking his cameras, his notes, his supplies. He knew that whatever happened tonight, he had to be prepared to face it, to record it, to survive it. Outside, the fog swallowed the town, the streets, the lights, enveloping everything in its dense, moist embrace. And then, the whispers started, soft at first, then growing clearer, more insistent. They called to Jamie, beckoning him to step into the fog, into the heart of Heroic's curse. As Jamie stood at the threshold of his cottage, the chilling embrace of the fog seeped through the cracks of the door, whispering his name. The voices were not just echoes now, they were clear, compelling, luring him into the depths of the night. With every fiber of his being screaming against the decision, Jamie stepped out into the fog, his camera slung over his shoulder, his flashlight piercing the dense white mist ahead. The streets of Heroic, once familiar during the day, had transformed into an alien landscape. The fog muffled all sounds, making his footsteps sound hollow on the old cobblestone paths. The street lamps were dim orbs of light, floating in the sea of mist, barely illuminating the path forward. Jamie's heart pounded in his chest as he moved towards the center of town, towards the ancient tree that seemed to be the heart of the town's curse. As he walked, the whispers grew louder, more desperate. They were not just calling him now, they were pleading, warning, threatening. Jamie pressed on, the cold air biting at his skin, his breath visible in the air. The town was eerily silent, devoid of life, as if even the stray animals had decided to hide from whatever was coming. When Jamie reached the town square, he found the ancient tree at its center waiting for him, its gnarled branches swaying gently in the wind. The ground around it was scattered with more objects than before, old toys, books, spectacles, each item a relic of someone who had vanished. The air around the tree was colder, and Jamie could feel the pull of it, an almost magnetic draw. Setting up his camera, Jamie prepared to document whatever was to occur. He didn't have to wait long. The air grew colder still, and a low hum began to resonate around the square, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The fog began to swirl violently, centering around the ancient tree, and Jamie's flashlight flickered erratically. From the fog, the figures emerged, more numerous than before. The Hollow Ones. Their forms were clearer now, their faces etched with pain and sorrow, their eyes empty pools of despair. They moved towards Jamie, slowly, deliberately, as if each step was measured and heavy with purpose. Jamie's mind raced with fear, but he stood his ground, filming, watching as the Hollow Ones stopped just at the edge of the light cast by his flashlight. They spoke in unison, a voice that was both ancient and heartbreaking. The time has come. The cycle must complete. Will you join us, or will you end us? Jamie, overwhelmed by the presence of the spectral figures, realized what they were asking. Heroic's curse was not just a series of hauntings, it was a cycle of sacrifice, of renewal. Every 50 years, the town offered souls to the forest, to the ancient forces it harbored, to maintain a fragile peace. With trembling hands, Jamie made a decision. He spoke into his camera, his voice steady despite the terror gripping him. I am here to document, to understand, not to join or to end. But perhaps there is another way. Turning to the Hollow Ones, Jamie continued, what if the cycle can be broken? What if Heroic can be freed? The Hollow Ones paused, their whispers quieting. After a moment that felt like an eternity, they responded, then show us the way, outsider. Show us the light or be consumed by the darkness. With the challenge set, Jamie's mind raced. He thought of all the lore he had read, the superstitions and the stories. He quickly formed a plan, based on a blend of old town lore and his own intuition. He directed the light from his flashlight, not at the Hollow Ones, but at the ancient tree, illuminating its twisted form. Then, taking a risk, Jamie stepped forward, breaking the circle of his own safety, and placed his hands upon the bark of the ancient tree. He recited words from Agnes's library, words meant for sealing and unbinding, words of old magic forgotten by most but preserved in the dusty tomes of Heroic's library. The ground trembled, the air shimmered, and the Hollow Ones shrieked, their forms wavering as if caught in a storm. The tree's branches writhed, and from its base, a light began to emerge, growing brighter, enveloping everything. Jamie felt the energy surge through him, a connection forming between him, the tree, and the hollow ones. The light grew blinding, and as Jamie's eyes closed against the brightness, he heard one final whisper, "Thank you." When the light dimmed and Jamie opened his eyes, the town square was empty. The fog had lifted, and the early morning light painted the streets with hues of orange and pink. The tree was gone, leaving behind only a small sapling in its place.